it's important for me and you and your listeners, for everybody to know, I most certainly differentiate between Bitcoin and Hedera. And a lot of the more utopian and breathless sorts of things that have been said have really specifically been about that one blockchain protocol, Bitcoin and network. And I am not at all skeptical about the idea of there being a small number of standard ways to negotiate the contents of a log in a low trust environment. And that seems like, the world needs that. There's things that valuable things that people are going to do with that.
Welcome to Hedera Hashgraph's Gossip About Gossip. If you are a developer, an entrepreneur, crypto enthusiast, or just trying to learn more about how distributed ledger technology and Hedera Hashgraph will impact your industry, then you'll love the episodes that we have coming up. Bookmark us, add us to your podcast app, and stay tuned.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of Gossip About Gossip. I'm your host, Cooper Kunz, and I'm extremely excited to be joined by Tim Berglund, the Senior Director of Developer Advocacy at Confluent. Hopefully I got that title right, Tim.
That works for me, yes.
How are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Cooper?
I'm wonderful. Well, I'm incredibly excited to have you on the podcast. I think we have a lot to talk about. But before diving into the work that you do at Confluent, how you feel about distributed ledgers, and maybe even Hedera specifically, could you tell people a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, I sure can. So I run the developer advocacy team here at Confluent. So my wife and I have been married for 30 years, just celebrated our anniversary in July. Got 3 adult children. They're all married and living on opposite coasts. So I am an empty nester, which I think is actually pretty legit. I love my kids, love seeing my kids, but emptiness is a pretty solid gig. I recommend it. The professional CV, I started my software development career writing firmware in the early 90s, wrote code on a lot of 8-bit parts and some bigger 16-bit machines. Used to think if you didn't debug your software with a soldering iron and an oscilloscope, you weren't a real programmer, which is a thing that a young engineer might think. And then I found out that was deeply not true. Kind of around 1999, 2000, pivoted to be we didn't say full stack Java developer, but that's what I was. And did that for a while and then kind of drifted into training and figured out I really liked doing that a lot. I was pretty good at it. In 2010, nobody said developer relations, but started taking roles that looked more like that. Lots of speaking at conferences and trying to explain technologies to newcomers and make it easier for people to join a new technology community and figure out a new way of thinking about source control or databases or software architectures and event streaming and that kind of thing. So that's my jam. Built a few teams that do that. I like doing that. And I like being on podcasts and talking about things. So, this works out pretty well.
Yeah, that is great. I know from my conference circuits, you are one of the most familiar faces. I feel like I see you and other people from the Confluent team always talking, giving demos, live streams, and they're always fantastic, always very impressive. So
Thanks.
Yeah, and you were doing it before I feel like the trend kind of kicked in. Like I feel like we're kind of in maybe not a golden age, but a gold rush towards developer relations programs.
Yeah, I mean, there's a that's funny putting it in the gold rush era. There's a gold rush and a cholera epidemic right now. So it's kind of, this game has changed a lot in the last 6 months, and we don't quite know. Although we've done a lot of adapting to the pandemic and moved programs online, and I think successfully. My industry, such as it is, the developer relations world, we're definitely wondering, okay, what's next? Everybody, actually being together in person matters a lot. Zoom's good. Zoom's real good. I've, been a remote employee for 20 years. I know how to do that, but no, bodies matter. And when are we going to get back to that? That's kind of a thing that everybody seems to be thinking. Of course, we don't know.
Yeah, I think myself and the rest of our developer advocates and Lena on our events team are all thinking very much the same thing.
Oh yeah.
And very excited when we can get back in person, do in-person trainings and workshops and, just see each other again. It should be good.
Yeah.
So for people who don't know I see Kafka as one of the most popular technologies to date. It's part of almost everyone's architecture, or at least I would say it's part of almost everyone's architecture. But for people who aren't super familiar with Kafka, could you explain it at like a 10,000-foot view? Like, what is it? What do people use it for? And how does Confluent fit into the picture there?
Totally. Okay, so Kafka is a distributed event streaming platform. And if you don't know what Kafka is already, probably that definition is really not going to help you. But you got to start with a sentence at some point. So historically, the kinds of software architectures that most of us who are alive and building systems today have worked on start with a model of state. And that model of state is represented in a database. And then there are applications that grow up around that database. And you think of, the progress of the system has to do with the mutating of that state and the mediating of the current state back out to users. Even that is like so helplessly abstract. But you know what I'm talking about. There's a database, there's a web app, people throw little blobs of JSON at you, you put them in the relational database. And later on, you get them out of the relational database, you serialize them as JSON, you send them to the front end every day until you die. I mean, that's kind of what applications look like.
Until you die or until your application dies. It's one of the two.
Or maybe you get to retire first. We don't really know how that ends. But Kafka recommends an alternative approach, which is to think of the world as events. Things happen. And what you do is you have some program that becomes aware of one of those events, and that's somebody submits a form or clicks on a website, or my smart thermostat this morning saw that I turned the heat on for the first time this season. These are all events, and you produce those events into a durable log called a topic. And so what Kafka is kind of physically is this distributed system that maintains these durable event logs. And a log, just as a reminder, is a sequence of immutable entries. And when you write to it, you write to the end of it. And when you read it, you scan it. It's not like an index thing or anything where you do sophisticated kinds of queries on it. You just usually read the latest thing off the end. That's physically what Kafka is. Also, there's a broader ecosystem story, and I won't elaborate it because there's other things we want to get onto. But once you've got that distributed log thing nailed, you can scale that, you can replicate that. You have a way of reading and writing those things. Other needs crop up around that, like you need to integrate non-event-driven systems. You need a data integration framework. That's a thing called Kafka Connect. You are going to do computations around those events that you read out, and there are going to be certain patterns that emerge in those computations where you find everyone solving the same problem over and over again. So you need, a stream processing framework. At some point, you're going to miss SQL. We do this. We say, no, we don't want to build our system around a database anymore. Who needs that database? Well, of course you do. You need lots of databases, and you miss SQL anyway. So now there's like a SQL for a thing called KSQL-DB for processing data in Kafka. You're going to need to manage the schemas of all these events because that event is some serialized object. That object is going to evolve. You need to manage those schemas. So all these little bits and pieces evolve around that central event log. And that's all very, very important part of the story. You need to know those things if you're going to be a mature Kafka user. But the fundamental abstraction is it's a log. It's a collection of logs. And you build systems on top of that basic abstraction.
That is a wonderful explanation. It does seem, very abstract at, some point, but when you start talking about it, in terms of this broader ecosystem and how it can fit together with things like SQL and things that are a little bit more familiar to some of the newer engineers out there, it's really interesting how powerful that simple concept of distributed running log can be for what you're building.
It emerges. I mean, it's at the center of the Tootsie Roll, Tootsie Pop center. Tootsie Roll center of the Tootsie Pop is the thing. It's not funny by the time I actually get the words out. It's at the center of every database you've ever used. There's a log. And non-trivial distributed systems, logs tend to emerge as a way of negotiating the state between the various independent parts of the system. So Kafka architecturally is an attempt to say, look, you're going to have one of these. Here's a standard one that everybody's using. Just be that. And let's have an ecosystem of components grow up around that we can all sort of standardize around.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And when you talk about topic management, event schemas, state maintenance, all these things are, super familiar to people who are probably familiar with the Hedera consensus service, which is, one of the newer product offerings on Hedera Hashgraph.
We both are about keeping track of a sequence of things and expecting that those things don't change once they've happened.
Absolutely, which I'm sure we can get into in a second, but where does Confluent fit into that picture? Like, what part of that ecosystem are you doing at your company?
Confluent is a company that is building a cloud service and an enterprise capable event streaming platform based on Apache Kafka. So Apache Kafka is a project of the Apache Software Foundation, and it's governed, as all ASF projects are, by an elected project management committee that has its own independent governance and lifecycle and open process for negotiating new features and prioritizing bugs and deciding when stuff's going to get merged and all that kind of stuff, as ASF projects do. And then there's Confluent, who makes, well, first of all, a classical on-prem enterprise version of Kafka with enhancements to the core, stuff around the core, like security, for example, is a big draw there, and tools that make running multi-region Kafka easier, stuff like that. And that, of course, is governed by internal Confluent processes and product management and all that. We also have a cloud service, Confluent Cloud, that is on the one hand a fully managed Kafka service, a bunch of topics in the sky. On the other hand, it's got integrated Confluent Connect connectors for integrating to cloud data sources and syncs, integrated KSQL. It's kind of like if you wanted a really good, well-integrated Kafka cloud service, what would you expect to be there? You wouldn't want just raw topics and I enter a number of brokers I want. That's sort of crass hosting. Confluent Cloud is the fully managed Kafka that we imagine everyone would want.
That makes a lot of sense. And they have you and a wonderful developer relations team doing trainings, teaching people, spreading the good word about Kafka.
Helping people get started, and people who have gotten started and need some more advanced help with certain things like integrating Kafka or Confluent platform or Confluent Cloud into a mature DevOps culture, some of the finer points of things to do with stream processing and features of Confluent platform. We get involved in those too.
That is great. And, before diving into talking about blockchain, distributed ledgers, Hedera, who are some of the most notable users of Kafka? Like, is there any great use cases that you point to and be like, that runs on our systems?
Yeah. And see, I'm terrible at this, Cooper, because there's I know of customers and I know of some open source users, and I'm not in sales, so I'm not doing
There's too many of them, to be honest.
No, but I know them, and I'm like, is that one referenceable? Okay, a few of them, I'm pretty sure Fortnite is. I'm thinking of all these kid-oriented ones because I just did this Kafka for Kids video at Kafka Summit. Roblox, Home Depot, big banks, big national scale or global scale retailers, commonly Kafka users. So people who are doing big things are very much getting on board.
Anything ambitious in real time, it seems.
Yes.
That makes sense. I think our listeners will definitely love the Fortnite shout out as well. So that's pretty
nice.
popular in these crowds. And so, Tim, I've known you for a few years, and I would maybe call you a blockchain skeptic. Maybe you're skeptical about distributed ledgers. Maybe you're skeptical about cryptocurrencies. You are building a real-time event streaming service or work on one. And so it's a totally common reaction to this industry. A lot of people say, we don't need another append-only log, especially one that's this incredibly slow and inefficient. I would love to just get your thoughts on, the distributed ledger industry at whole. Is it something that interests you?
Yeah, just within constraints, right? I'm not particularly millenarian about it. It's important for me and you and your listeners, for everybody to know, I most certainly differentiate between Bitcoin and Hedera. And a lot of the more utopian and breathless sorts of things that have been said have really specifically been about that one blockchain protocol, Bitcoin and network. And I am not at all skeptical about the idea of there being a small number of standard ways to negotiate the contents of a log in a low trust environment. And that seems like, the world needs that. There's things that valuable things that people are going to do with that. It doesn't seem. Oh, let's just get flamed. Like, what are you going to do with Bitcoin? This is the least possible suitable technology for a payment system that I can even imagine. What was anyone ever thinking? Like, if you look at the architecture of this thing, I can't. It's interesting in lots of ways, and I know some people have made money there. It's more of like an investment vehicle than any kind of potential payment system, just for performance reasons. I mean, it's one of those things. I was given my CV before, and it was around like 1999, 2000 that I left the firmware world and I came into the web world just in time for the .com crash. My timing is impeccable. And XML was becoming a thing then. And it might be strange if your career does not span the time in the early 2000s for you to imagine a time when XML was a thing. Like, what do you mean a thing? I mean, it's a format.
I cannot relate to XML being a thing in my career.
No. And why would you? What's your XML strategy was a company that you could ask a software vendor. And I'm new to the IT world, coming from the firmware world where things were, I think, a little simpler. Just assumed it was me. Okay. I just assumed there's something I don't understand here because I'm not smart enough to understand what it is that there could be to have an XML strategy. In retrospect, no, I was actually quite perspicacious on that point, and it was actually ridiculous to think of having an XML strategy, and we got over that, and the effects are still being felt. But it's the same way with Bitcoin. Like, you look at it for a second, you're like, wait, how? What? No, you can't. There's no payment technology here. What are you? But everybody's like, oh no, payments of the future, and so it's one of those things. And so yeah, that's kind of my whole view of the whole thing is colored by the fact that, a couple of years ago, you had real estate agents offering Bitcoin seminars that, something's amiss. I mean, not that real estate agent is a.
Did you ever have real estate agents offering XML seminars though, Tim?
That didn't happen, to be fair. So Bitcoin definitely got bigger than XML. And so given that, yeah, I've got skepticism there. Do I have skepticism around the notion that there should be a way, like I said, to negotiate the contents of a log in a low trust environment? No, that's an awesome technological idea. And as I look at these things, Hedera Hashgraph seems like a kind of a more sane way of solving the problem, just because of its performance characteristics in time and in energy use. And I stop there. Those are good enough.
Well, we appreciate that. I think that notion or that tagline of, negotiating logs or coming to, an agreement on logs in a low trust environment is really aligned with where we feel the industry is moving. We don't think of these systems as necessarily payments only infrastructure or something that's going to upend all the banks in the world or anything like that, but it's going to provide new opportunities for ways to build applications and software. At the end of the day, that's all that this really is.
Right.
But it is interesting that you mentioned Bitcoin specifically, so I'll talk to maybe, one example here is like Microsoft has come out and said that they want decentralized identity to become a first-class citizen of Microsoft's identity suite. And Microsoft's identity offering is actually anchored to the Bitcoin blockchain, which is really interesting. So they're using Bitcoin to manage a running log of hashes where maybe every time you change your phone or change your password, it'll take an hour, maybe 3 hours, and submit a transaction to the Bitcoin network.
And that's literally Bitcoin. That's not just a blockchain thing.
No, it is quite literally built on the Bitcoin network. Okay. So they're using.
Can I say on air that that's a terrible idea?
You can totally say that.
Okay, I can't believe how bad that idea is, but please go on.
I was going to also mention the fact that it's using, I don't know if you're familiar with the technology called IPFS, the Interplanetary File System.
Yes.
They built kind of a framework called SideTree, the SideTree protocol, which uses IPFS to manage your decentralized identity and verifiable credentials, which eventually get anchored to Bitcoin. And
not inherently, that's not inherently a part of the IPFS architecture, right?
No, so it's not built
I didn't
into
think so.
IPFS. It uses IPFS to store the data that's going on.
Got it. IPFS actually seems, I don't know it well, but it seems pretty legit to me from what I have seen. It seems
I
interesting.
am I am also a very big fan of IPFS as well. I think that they're doing very interesting stuff in the space. I'm very interested in like peer-to-peer data sharing, actually like trusting the integrity of your data when you're sharing it and kind of decentralizing that as well. It's very interesting to hear you say that that's a terrible idea from Microsoft.
Yeah. Um, I'm willing to be told I'm wrong. And I'm sure there's somebody who can defend that, but just on the face of it, that seems like not a thing that you would want.
I
A
would
distributed ledger of some kind. Again, this is not a bad idea, but Bitcoin itself seems to me like it's only useful for paying for a certain small number of commodities and speculating. And that is, I guess, that is my. You picked up on my negative attitude towards these things, and that's probably where that comes from. It's not the idea; it's that Bitcoin itself, and like ideologically, I'd love there to be a completely decentralized, really market-based currency. That's a fascinating idea. Nobody's done it really in a while, but
But if you took the money and the monetary incentives and the skin in the game out, at the end of the day, it's just a fundamentally slow, weird architecture to try to build systems with.
yeah, this is a bad way to negotiate leaders on a database. Basically, let's not do that.
That is very much what proof of work sounds like. And so, you're building in this world of event streaming architectures. You acknowledge that Hashgraph and Hedera has a much more interesting ecosystem or offering in terms of our speed. We can handle tens of thousands of transactions per second in this low trust environment. We'll come to consensus and a provable finality on those transactions within an average of like 2 to 3 seconds, which has certain use cases. But comparing that to something like Kafka, I don't know how fast Kafka is going to scale or how many transactions it can handle, but it's orders of magnitude more.
Literally, yes.
And
The
so
difference being, Kafka does not make the assumption of low trust. Kafka makes an assumption of high trust. All of the interesting authentication and authorization interfaces, and sometimes these are in Confluent's commercial product or cloud service. Some of them are in open source Apache Kafka. Like, you got to have to matrix all that out. Usually, if enterprise security integration is a thing you want, you probably also want to spend money on software. So that's why that stuff tends not to fall into open source products and tends to fall into the enterprise extensions. So if we could just say whatever to that, of course, quote unquote, Kafka has security in that sense. So you can make sure the person, the principal connecting to a cluster to produce or consume from a topic has credentials, is a directory entry somewhere and can speak to that claim with a certain level of authority. But that's what we mean by trust. You authenticate, Confluent Cloud data is encrypted at rest and encrypted in flight. Kafka, it's not encrypted at rest, but you can encrypt it in flight. If I have access to a Kafka broker, can I go hex edit topic? And if I know the file format, I can probably do that.
I think you speak to this very well, perhaps even, much better than people who spend their full time working in this industry. What would so you have two different types of immutable logs and you're building architectures with them. One of them can handle potentially millions, if not more transactions a second. And you have something like Hedera that can do 10,000, maybe 100,000, maybe a little bit more than that. What kind of use cases do you see for enterprise applications in this kind of low trust environment?
Oh, hey, good question. Yeah, when you can't trust, that's when you're going to have a large number of clients all wanting to speak up about the state of the system, and those clients you don't really have a way of knowing who they are. So large number of clients in a Kafka system means logged in users or devices on a network, smart thermostats or SCADA terminals or something like that. You know how I said SCADA. You know how great security is in that world. They're all perfectly secure. But you have a strong knowledge claim about who the client is that's doing the the producing. And so anytime you don't, you have to trade off performance. And Hedera is like, again, I'm not a paid endorser. I'm not saying this because I'm on your podcast. I am sort of blown away at how fast you can run it. That's super cool, especially relative to, the thing that takes hours to write to the ledger. I still can't believe it's even true, but it's a very high performing one, but you are going to trade off orders of magnitude performance in exchange for the trust. And so, yeah, I don't know specifically. I mean, I've heard of online gaming being a thing, and I might even not mind talking through that because it's not clear to me why that's low trust.
Yeah, I mean,
payments, honestly, we could do payments.
Yeah, using it as part of a payments infrastructure, typically makes a lot of sense. You see a lot of interest in like ERP or ways that you can basically have multi-party vendors bidding on assets at once, whether those are known parties or unknown parties. Kind of provable auctions as well is kind of an interesting area of interest where you have utterly no trust in who's bidding on specific things, whether it's an eBay-like auction or vendors bidding on a contract agreement, whatever you kind of need if you need to have that provably fair ordering with no trust or low trust going into it.
But you can do it in real time.
Instead of a couple hours.
Yes.
Which is very, very interesting.
Bitcoin just wants us to slow down the pace of our life, Cooper. I mean, we just want everything now and so much rush. No, thanks. I'll slow my own life down.
Watch the Bitcoin community is either going to all follow you on Twitter after this or just send you a lot of hate mail. There's going to be no middle ground.
I am 100% good with both. And that's not because I have even the slightest shred of personal animosity towards anyone in the Bit community. If we were doing things like going out and getting drinks together, I would 100% do that with anybody there. But yeah, you're right. Things could happen on Twitter.
I think a lot about building real-time services in this like low trust environment. And a lot of people do things in their applications that some of them require low trust. For example, like payments or an auction, and also want to build things into their architectures that can have total trust, like a chat between people or, just image rendering or video sharing. And I mention this because in one of our most recent hackathons, the Hedera 20 virtual hackathon, the winning team that won our grand prize actually built a bridge that can easily connect Kafka deployments to Hedera's consensus service. So, any type of...
It would be a Hedera sync connector in Kafka Connect terms.
Yeah, something like that where, you're passing messages into a specific Kafka topic, multiple of them, specific events within that architecture are important enough to kind of put into this low trust environment. Is that something that you think is, interesting? You've been around the industry for a long time. You saw the XML hype. And it's funny because I'm just picturing a bunch of product managers, sitting around with a PowerPoint deck about XML.
Cooper, and it was like, Office 99 or whatever version of Office they were using. And they were certainly emailing PPT files. This is before PPTX. And what's the X for? Anyway.
But so my question is, do you think that that's a viable architecture? Do you think that that's something that's interesting in the world of engineering? Is that new, or is it just kind of, repackaging something that already existed?
No, I think that's an extremely important integration point. I don't know that the synergy is a synergy, though. Like stuff that connects to Kafka, you do that because you have a reason for that other thing. Like there's an Elasticsearch sync connector. You need that because stuff that's in Kafka is kind of hard to do interesting searches on. It's not really how logs work. So you take the stuff in the log and you dump it into Elastic, but because you have a reason for Elastic, and so if you have a reason for low trust consensus, then there's a particular Kafka topic that's going to be one of the untrusted parties who's writing to that log. And I don't know off the top of my head, and I'm always bad with use cases. I am. It's like company names and use cases. I'd make the worst sales engineer in the world. Or maybe if I were one, I'd be better at that. But I don't know off the top of my head where the multipliers are for those two things working really well together. But when you're in one of those use cases, where you need Hashgraph, then some of the systems that are going to be bidding for the next entry on the log, those are going to be systems that are Kafka based. If you've got a dozen microservices doing something, well, there's probably going to be a Kafka there. There's a decent chance there will be one, and it's super nice and clean for one of them to create a topic that here are all of my things I'd like to write into the Hashgraph, my claims on the Hashgraph. And it's just a nice feature of Kafka architectures for some service to be able to produce a message to that topic and say, okay, it's done. That service's responsibility, the developer who's trying to write to the graph, responsibility is met. I've written to the topic, it's there. And now there's this connector that will go read from that topic and, I forgot the name of the service, but talk the API that connects you to the Hedera
Consensus service,
HCS.
Yeah. So in my mind, not that we have anything ongoing with any of these companies, but you could imagine pretty cleanly like an eBay auction, a Craigslist auction, a Facebook marketplace auction that are all running their own instances of Kafka, but they have a centralized actual auction mechanism that's running on Hashgraph for who actually gets to purchase the item. And instances like that where you can kind of start creating what we like to think of as decentralized applications that kind of plug and play into their own world. And maybe if you don't like the interface that eBay has, or if you don't like the interface that Craigslist has, you can still kind of interact with the databases in this same way with that low trust environment. Okay,
so it's like the log, we talk about the database inside out, or the centralized log. Yep. Through which your services negotiate state and interact with one another. That's here, he says, making a little circle with his hands.
On the voice-only podcast.
Let the record show, yes. Inside the walls of my trusted security environment. But then we federate those. And how do we negotiate state between those? Well, guess what? It's a log. It's still a log. And so
I think the title of this episode is going to be Logs on Logs on Logs.
It's logs all the way down. Logs within logs, wheels within wheels. These are all options.
Well, this has been super interesting, Tim. And I think we're running out of time here, but I really appreciate your insights and being able to help educate our community on this kind of world of event streaming architectures, why logs are so interesting, why Bitcoin might be the XML of the distributed ledger industry, as you so valiantly put that. Is there anything else that you would like to add to this conversation?
No, Cooper, honestly, it's been great to talk to you. Great to see you again. And I appreciate the chance to catch up and talk through these things.
Yeah, it's great to see you again as well. Hopefully I can run into you at a conference in person sometime soon. I think that would probably be the best thing that could come for all of us, especially in the developer relations community.
I would love it.
So if people want to follow you online or learn more about Kafka, where can they get in touch with you?
Well, they can get in touch with me on Twitter, TL Berglund. That's TLBERGLUND. If you want to learn more about Kafka, your best place to go is developer.confluent.io.
That is great. And a lot of the Hedera community might know Anthony Middleton, who used to be at Hedera. If you are familiar with him, he now works on Tim's team at Confluent. And so if you talk to Anthony or stay in touch with him, I'm sure he can help you out and help you learn more about Confluent as well. So
awesome community manager. Technically, he reports to a peer of mine, Ale Murray, but great guy. Yes, very, very happy to have him in the Kafka world.
Thank you for clarifying that, Tim, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for listening to Hedera Hashgraph's Gossip About Gossip. If you liked the episode, please subscribe, rate and review, and also share and tell your friends.
Or connect with us on social media like Twitter, Instagram, etc. at Hashgraph, particularly if you want to leave us feedback on the podcast. We look forward to hearing from you.